This is Arts Alive. I'm Linda Philippi, and my guest today is Richard Royce. Richard is a local artist and artist facilitator and musician and all kinds of stuff. So I'm really anxious to hear all the things that you're working on.
Well, great. So let's start off with a little of my background.
Sure, that'd be fabulous.
I started off at the University of Wisconsin. I got a master's degree there in fine arts. I then went to France, where I continued my education in fine art and studied at the Atelier 17, which is a famous studio for printmaking. And I spent 2 years there. Then I got a job teaching at USC in LA, and I taught printmaking there for 2 years. And then I was introduced to printing for other artists. I got a call from Ken Tyler, who was the master printer at Gemini, which is a big printmaking facility in LA, professional. And they had a project with Roy Lichtenstein, and they didn't have somebody to do it. They needed a good engraver. And by this time I had become an excellent engraver on copper, and he said, well, can you do wood blocks? And I said, sure.
Why not?
Why not? Never did a wood block. But anyway, I took on the project and cut the 5-block woodcut for called Modern Head, which was Roy Lichtenstein's first woodcut.
Interesting.
And I printed the edition, and I got the juices going about being a printer for others. So I opened up my own studio called Atelier Royce, and I ran it for 25 years.
Oh my goodness.
During that time, it moved. We were in LA. I moved up to Oregon here for a short period. I then moved to New York. And while I was in New York, I did a lot of work with the major, we call them blue chip artists. Roy Lichtenstein, Jim Rosenquist, Claire Falkenstein, Larry Rivers, Marisol, Paul Jenkins, those artists. So I have a couple of examples of some of the work we did at that time.
And let me just ask you this while you're digging around in there, and that's, how did you become drawn to engraving? Because it seems like that's such a particular sort of talent.
Well, it's part of the printmaking etching. It's part of etching. So there's the working with acids, metal plates, and all the different techniques. And then there's taking a copper plate with a tool that's like a sharp knife called a burin, and you're cutting the lines one at a time. Actually, I'm going to show you a couple examples of that because that's kind of nice. This, if you can get a picture of that, if you can get close in on that, that's an example of an engraving. And I'll show you another. This is another example that might be clearer.
Okay, we'll try that one. That's amazing.
And that's a print from a copper plate. It was inked up. What happens is you're cutting away the metal with this tool, and then you rub ink into that groove and then wipe away everything else. And you're wiping the surface of these white areas, and what's left is the line. You then put a piece of damp paper on it and run it through a press, and then it transfers the ink to the paper. And so it comes out like that.
That's amazing.
And so that was a specialty that I did along with a lot of other things. But so I had become an engraver that was, pretty competent engraver. And that's why Ken called me, and I did that woodblock for Roy Lichtenstein. In the course of the next number of years, I did work for Hamaguchi, Yosho Hamaguchi, which is he's a Japanese artist. He's
that's beautiful.
The national treasure of Japan. And I've done some of his etchings, some of his mezzotints. I printed them. I didn't make the plates. He made the plates himself.
Okay.
Now, mezzotint is an interesting method. It's where you have a copper plate and you rough it up really like sandpaper.
Okay.
Using sandpaper or a knife, a rounded knife that you're rocking back and forth in all directions. It gets very rough. Then you scrape it back with a scraper and you polish it So you're building your image out of the dark.
Oh, okay.
And then when you rub the ink in and wipe it away, it holds on to those areas that are scraped. And you get a modulated image that way.
Interesting.
During this period, I did work for Jesse Allen.
Ooh, okay.
An artist that was very well known in San Francisco area. That's an example of his work.
So people would, sometimes you would create the plate for them, and sometimes you would print from the plate they created.
Most of the time, the artist would come into my studio and I would help them to make the plate.
Okay.
Remember, these people are painters or sculptors, and they don't really know how to do prints.
Right.
So under my guidance, I would make a plate for them, get it ready, and I'd say, okay, now you draw with this material, just the way you paint. And now they draw on the plate, and then I put it in acid and prepare the plate, and then I take a print of it. Now I show it to them. They say, yeah, I like that. I don't like that part, so I'll scrape that out, fix it.
Okay.
Now they like it. Now we're going to go for the second plate, and we're going to add something overlaid on top of it. And we build the image that way.
That's really time consuming, isn't it?
Very time consuming. And so I did a lot of etching for a long period. Here's an example of my teacher, Stanley Hayter, in Paris, France. This is the kind of work he did. He's very famous for prints. Here's some examples of his work in this book here. If anyone knows printmaking, these will be familiar to them. He's considered the father of modern printmaking.
Okay.
He opened up a studio in Paris in 1927, invited all of the artists at the time to come in and explore the medium and expand the medium. So Ernst, Duchamp, Picasso, all of these major artists came in and did prints. And you might say that Picasso, his etchings that he's done were probably started from his experiences at Hayter's.
Yeah, probably.
But anyway, I studied with him, and then, so that's the kind of work that he was doing.
Oh, that's, yeah. Good size.
And let's see, well, some other interesting things that I did in the course of the period of printing for other people. Not only did we do etching, but we moved into sculpture.
Oh.
And we were doing an innovative approach to sculpture. We were making their pieces in resin and then spraying molten metal onto the resin and then polishing it as a bronze sculpture. And here's a good example of that.
How interesting.
This was Ruth Rodman's work. We called it fusion bronze, and it was an actual metal sprayed onto the top of the plastic or resin surface. Then we polish it down and make the sculpture.
Is that technique still used?
Not much. Since we ended our, when I retired, there wasn't really anyone else doing it. I was the only one in the country doing that. But it is possible to find someone who's doing metallizing, which is where we got that method from industry, where they build up metal bumpers on cars and things like that were worn down. So it's an industry method that we co-opted for fine art. This was an interesting project that was done by Richard Emanuel when we were in Massachusetts. That was an 8-foot sculpture that we covered with bronze. He had an actual skull, fur, rope, all different materials.
That's very interesting.
And then we sprayed it with metal, and then we polished it and patinaed it as a bronze sculpture.
Who bought that?
I don't know. It's once we finished the work with the artist then was responsible for marketing his own work.
I mean, you know, that's not a necessarily really accessible piece. So I mean, you have to have just the right spot.
That's right. Now we did work for an artist by the name of Marisol in New York City. These are some examples of the work we did for her.
Oh, that's
and these were made in cast paper.
Okay.
We were doing a lot of cast paper at the time.
Were papers put into a form?
Yes.
Okay.
So she would make a form, and then we'd press the paper pulp into that. And this is Paul Jenkins, a painter who was also a very fine sculptor. And we did a lot of work with him with pressing paper pulp into a mold.
Okay.
And then he would paint the paper afterwards.
Okay, interesting.
So that was his work. Let's see.
There's so many different kinds of art.
There's all different kinds.
Yeah.
Now, you know who Picasso is?
Yes.
Well, he was married to a woman by the name of Françoise Gillot.
Okay.
And we did some work with her.
Oh.
And these are handmade paper pieces. That's her right there, clowning around. We would make a piece of paper, a handmade paper, and then cut out a shape right here, and then embed that in the paper.
Okay.
And so the final paper was all one sheet of paper, but with all the image in it.
Interesting. Okay.
So that's what I did for other people. And then in my own work,
At the same time, you were
at the
pursuing
same
your
time
own
I was
work.
doing my own work.
Okay.
And I did a lot of sculpture, which is, these are some examples of some of the sculptural pieces that I've done. Large linear drawings, very much taking the engraving, the engraved line, and putting it into the third dimension. So you can see these are up in Washington. And there's another example. This one is the Art Mine Gallery up in Port Haddock.
Oh.
It's a very large piece. It's about 13 feet high. But you can see it's a line drawing. It's like an engraving that walked
It really
off the
is.
page.
Exactly. Like your lines just got up and went outside.
That's right. And the way I would develop the drawings for the sculptures is that I would do something like an engraved drawing on paper and then translate that into a sculpture. So I would first do the drawing, then I would take the line, one of these lines that are in it, and I'd take a piece of rebar, industrial rebar, and bend it to that shape. Then I would take another line and bend the rebar to that. Then I'd put the two together and weld them wherever they met, wherever they joined. And the sculpture would build as a result, and then you'd have this big piece. Then I would treat it with various materials so that it would be colorful, or however, if it needed to stand up in the weather, I would put a material on it that prevented it from
Rust-Oleum.
rusting. Rust-Oleum, and then lots of paint and various kinds of things. Here's some examples of my own smaller works. This is a bronze sculpture. Here's another one.
That's interesting.
When I was working, and these are in that method that I was talking about, the fusion bronze, where I sprayed over a surface and created a bronze on top of something else. This one here is interesting. In cast paper, I did this work for the museum, the Rosa Parks Museum in, I think it's Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay.
And they needed the interior of a bus in paper, in white. So these are laid out against my studio once I had made them. But I went into an actual bus, and I took impressions off of the bus, a mold, and then I cast the paper into that, and that's what ended up in that work.